Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me drop into your Zoomiverse. Hi, I'm Dan Rockmore, Director of the Neukom Institute for Computational Science here at Dartmouth College. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the third Neukom Institute Awards for Literary Arts and Speculative Fiction. It's part of a broader literary arts program. We also give a prize for playwriting that was done earlier in the year, all generally around themes of technology and society and humanity, putting a spotlight, if you like, on the intersection of the arts and the sciences. So these awards are about speculative fiction. The label speculative fiction, while it is a relatively recent invention as a genre, one could certainly trace it back to at least as far as to Jules Verne or H.G. Wells's The World Set Free. Wells actually calls such works, quote, fantasias of possibility, which I've always loved, wherein the writer, quote, takes some great creative tendency or group of tendencies and develops its possible consequences in the future. It's a lovely characterization, an expansive characterization, allowing for all kinds of stories that push the boundaries of the possible. But even in that, it might be somewhat limiting. I also kind of like something that Arthur C. Clarke once wrote, that the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And I like that idea of small reach to reveal larger truths. So often, although not always, imagined futures of technology fuel such work, and this was the impetus for the Neukom Institute's creation of the awards that we're celebrating today. The mission of the Institute, which owes its founding to the extraordinary generosity of Bill Neukom, a former Dartmouth trustee in class of '64, is to support broadly work in computational science. And it has, over time, become increasingly clear, at least to me, that artistic work that explores the possibilities for technology and science, both good and bad, is as important, or at least differently important, as the work that directly develops or exploits such research and work. These awards in the literary arts speak to and recognize that critical perspective, and in particular, the power of great writing to create worlds that enable us, the readers, to explore the liminal space between the possible and the impossible. And in doing so, allow each of us to ask ourselves if these are worlds that we're currently inhabiting or we want to inhabit. This year, over 50 books were considered for the awards. Shortlists were constructed with the help of my colleagues here at Dartmouth, Peter Orner in creative writing, Tarek El-Aris in Middle Eastern studies, Eric Schaller in biology, as well as my friend and colleague at the Santa Fe Institute, Jessica Flack. Also of our judge for this year's competition, the award-winning spec fic novelist Sam Miller helped us build out the list. And I'd like to thank everybody for being so generous with their time in doing so. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to the recipients of the 2020 Neukom Institute Literary Arts Awards. And the winners each receive an honorarium of $5,000. I do not have the big cartoon check here, but congratulations to them on such an achievement. So it's my pleasure to first introduce the winner in the open category. There's an open category and a debut category, and that's Ted Chiang for his terrific book, Exhalation, a wondrous collection comprising a cauldron of scientific possibilities, writing styles, and imagination. Ted, welcome, and thanks again for your work. And the pool was so strong that a runner-up was also named in each category, and in the open category, I'd also like to take a moment to bring attention to the runner-up, Lindsay Drager, for her terrific book, The Archive of Alternate Endings, a haunting and provocative, quote-unquote, Nautilus shell, as per her the cover of her book, an exploration of the Hansel and Gretel story that interweaves backwards and forwards in time. Lindsay, if you're tuned in, congrats again to you for a wonderful piece of work. In the debut category, it is my pleasure to introduce and congratulate Cadwell Turnbull for his great book, The Lesson, a brilliant exploration of alien invasion through the lens of colonialism. Welcome, Cadwell. Thanks for coming, and thanks for writing such a great book. And I'd also like to take a moment to recognize the runner-up in the debut category, Taylor K. Mejia's We Set the Dark on Fire, a brilliant new work of YA fiction that creatively explores a near future and a disturbing near future of diminished women's and immigrants' rights wrapped up in mystery, intrigue, and romance. Taylor, congratulations. So I'm now eager to turn things over to our judge, Sam Miller, to lead us in a thoughtful, in the truest sense, full of thoughts panel. But before doing that, I'd like to give two final shout outs once again to Bill Neukom for his great generosity that makes this program possible, as well as all of our programming at the Neukom Institute, and also the great work of Christine Monagill, the Neukom Institute manager, who enabled us to meet in this virtual place, as well as for the help of David Hirsch and Dartmouth Communications for his help. So without further ado, Sam, take it away.
Awesome, thank you. So thank you both for your amazing books. This was lots of folks saw the finalist list and tons of my favorite writers are on there. And so it was a super hard decision. So thanks for that. But the thing that I really love about this award is its attempt to sort of really grapple with the engagement of science fiction and speculative fiction with science and with computational science. And I really love work that does that. And I love work that does that in really interesting ways, especially sort of outside the realm of the sort of conventional sciences. And so I think that both of your books are engaging with sciences beyond the sort of biology and chemistry and rocketry that many of us sort of think of as the classical province of hard science fiction, and thinking about things like history and linguistics and what consciousness is. So Cadwell, I'd like to start with you. Talk to us about the lesson, the origins of it, where it came from, what the hardest part was, what your favorite thing about it is.
Yeah, so I mean, the initial idea came from a dream. And I mean, I usually am not so lucky to have like my subconscious like give me a big idea like that. But I had this dream where aliens were, integrated into a small town. It was a small town in the dream. And they had, they looked like humans, they acted like humans, except when they got upset, they would respond with this hyper-violence. And the dream had a Mira-like character. Mira is the ambassador to the INA in the book. And it also had like a Derek-like character who was challenging the Mira-like character to think about the violence that she was enacting on the town and what that meant. And, Mira was starting to feel a little bit of guilt about that. And so that dream, because it just handed me such a full story, it stuck with me for a while. And then I finally decided that I wanted to set it in the Virgin Islands, where I grew up. And once I decided to do that, all kinds of ideas came to me about themes that would be explored. Cycles of violence, power dynamics, colonialism, faith and sexuality, and all of these things kind of just came out, organically out of the original concept. In terms of what was hard for me to do, besides finishing the book, it took a long time. And there was times when I thought I wasn't going to be able to get it done. The research, and for two reasons. So I did a lot of reading about the slave era of the Virgin Islands, the Danish Slave Society of the Virgin Islands. I read a book about the slave insurrection of 1733, which was this big moment in the US Virgin Islands history. And I read some pieces of a dissertation about the tribes of the east coast of Africa that later were abducted or enslaved and became the slaves that had the insurrection on St. John. And it was a lot of reading, oftentimes really dry reading. And so just getting through all of that reading was really hard. I had to give myself a regiment of at least like reading every day, at least a little bit, for over a year to get through all of the reading. And The other part of it was just really devastating to read, like especially the Danish Slave Society stuff. There was there was a lot of really cool depiction of what the culture was like then, you know, what the slave society was actually like, and the population of each group, like the population of blacks versus the whites, what they ate, what they wore, that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of detail about the brutal punishments that the slaves were susceptible to because they ran away or they weren't doing their work or something. And that was really hard to get to read and to try to render on the page. The slave insurrection was also difficult because it was successful for a while, and then eventually it was beat down, and a lot of slaves committed suicide, and the ones that were captured were tortured and executed. So that stuff was really hard to read and try to incorporate into the book. So yeah, I would say those were the big things that stick out to me. It's difficult.
One thing, you know, they always, the sort of basic creative writing advice they always give is to write what you know. But in my experience, often writing about what is personal and challenging and raw and real for you is hard. It can be really difficult. And so when exploring the history and to a certain extent the contemporary moments of the U.S. Virgin Islands, was there anything really difficult about that, or things that you struggled with whether or not to include because of how raw or real they might be to you or to others?
Right, I'm gonna get in trouble for talking about this. To some people, I might get a call later. But yeah, there was a big theme of the book was like questioning faith, and you know, questioning faith once you've become open to a big universe. And I have a couple characters in the book. One that has like pretty much, you know, has questioned Christianity, has been reading a lot of mythology and has moved away. One that's kind of like in that middle space, you know, dealing with whether or not she should walk away from her faith. And one that, you know, through her experience with the ENA, she really digs into her faith. And I wanted to be even-handed in that, but that was something that I struggled with whether or not to include because the Virgin Islands is very faith-based. You know, we have a really strong Christian culture, and so that was difficult, you know, thinking about trying to approach that. And then there was also, you know, one of the things that I really wanted to explore in the book was masculinity, you know, and how sometimes it can be destructive. And that was difficult, you know, trying to balance that against colonialism, because there's characters in the book that are really angry for legitimate reasons. But I was also trying to critique or explore the way that they respond to that anger and whether or not those choices were, what's the word I'm looking for, were wise, was responsible. And so it was really difficult for me to try to figure out that balance. Like, how do I be critical of toxic masculinity within a resistance context while also talking about resistance and the legitimacy of resistance? And, you know, I don't know if I answered that question well in the book or right now, but I think that it was something that was on my mind and something I you know, definitely woke up in the middle of the night, you know, sweating about.
Awesome. Well, it didn't feel like you were sweating. I feel like you handled it really well. To whatever extent I can assess these things. So Ted, this is sort of your first post-arrival book, and you know, after a long time writing amazing stuff for, you know, a relatively small audience of folks who read and really care about short science fiction. As opposed to novels, which tend to get all of the attention sometimes. A lot has changed for you since Arrival. You've had an Academy Award-winning film and New York Times bestsellerdom. So how has that changed your life, your process, your work, if at all?
Well, you know, it hasn't changed my daily life, in any major way. and I don't know that it's changed. Certainly, I don't think it has changed my process when it comes to writing. I mean, it is. It has been a little surreal to know that my work has reached a much wider audience than I ever thought it would. When I was writing for the science fiction magazines, and and like when my first collection came out, I was pretty much resigned to the fact. Well, I don't want to say resigned to the fact, but I had I guess my understanding of like my writing career was that I would only ever reach a very small readership. That was just the nature of writing short science fiction. And so it has been really, really kind of weird to and kind of surreal and bizarre to just contemplate that now there are sort of general readers out there who might read my book, and it is I think I think I'm a beneficiary of the hello?
Oh, there you are.
I don't know what happened there. It said the host muted me, and I was like, why did they do that?
It's no one on the screen.
So I think I've been a beneficiary of the sort of breaking down of genre boundaries, of the increasingly porous nature of the the wall between sort of contemporary literature and science fiction. There have been, and I think nowadays, a general readership, they have much more familiarity with science fiction tropes. So someone who does not read a lot of science fiction can still be assumed to be able to understand ideas like, oh, like an alternate history story, which I think back in the 90s, that was concepts like that were very hard for people to wrap their heads around. And of course, nowadays we are all thinking about the impact of technology on our lives. So I think that the fact that people are much they're used to thinking about ideas which were previously only the province of science fiction, and so yes, that I think is, I guess, what has enabled my work to connect with a wider audience, and it's great. It is also something that I guess I didn't really think I would ever live to see. I sort of assumed that that science fiction would remain, just a niche interest for the foreseeable future.
You mentioned that the experience has been a little surreal. Have the surreal moments, like say being on Obama's reading list, have any of those prompted potential story ideas, or made you put you in spaces that you might not have otherwise been in, where you've thought about things you might not normally have thought about?
I can't say that they have, at least not yet. But yeah, I suppose if I mean, yeah, if you see me writing a story in the future about, someone receiving, unimagined levels of attention, then I guess you will know that, yeah, something did occur to me for a story. But as so far, no, so far, not yet.
Fair enough. I would love to hear from both of you what your writing process is like, and whether, what it looks like now, especially now when we are, I don't know about you, but I haven't left my house in 7 months. So Cadwell, where are you at? What's your writing process like generally and currently?
Okay. Currently terrible. Generally though, if we're talking about just getting words on the page, I try to write early in the morning, a small chunk, an achievable burst of creativity. So 250 words has been my goal in the past, and it was the way that I finished the lesson after not finishing it for several years. And I tried to keep up with that as much as I can. It's been difficult lately because I just started a teaching job, and that has been taking, a lot of my, rightly so, a lot of my energy, and I've been enjoying it. But I try when I can to do that first thing. So first thing, get the writing out of the way when I have the most energy. I am a morning person when I need to be. That means that it's not always true. But when I need to be, I can get up really early and get something done. And then I spend the rest of my time, if I blocked out an hour or two to do some writing, I'll spend the rest of my time doing some reading or doing some sketching, and sketching is just basically playing around with an idea or writing it in different ways, trying to get the wording right for something that I'm thinking about, or outlining, which is, sometimes helpful. Lately, it's been hard to do everything in the same place. That's been a difficult thing to turn it off. So writing in the morning, having Zoom meetings, teaching, grading, reading, all of those things happening in the same place has been messing with my ability to focus. So sometimes I do have to go outside. I try to go outside into an open area and sit down with a notebook and write. And that has been helpful. Or I just go for a walk and I listen to an audiobook. I've been doing this thing now where I listen to nonfiction with audiobooks, and that has been really helpful for me to just get reading done in this time where it's difficult to just sit and look at something. I can't even watch movies right now. It's crazy. And movies has been my solace for a very long time, and I miss theater so much. I'm kind of getting off topic, but no.
It's all on topic. It's all part of the process.
Yeah, it's been a lot of my effort recently has just been trying to figure out a way to juggle all of the things and doing in a way that allows me to, at the end of the day, sit down and actually decompress instead of just checking emails until I fall asleep, which is, some of my days are like that. Too many of my days are like that.
The struggle is real. Yeah, the flip side of working from home is living at work.
Right.
At least for me in my day job. Ted, what about you? What's your process like pre and during pandemic, if there's a difference?
Well, I guess I'm gonna talk about process in a slightly different way. And rather than talk about it in sort of a day-to-day routine, I'll talk about it in terms of my process of developing a story idea, going from an idea to a story, and so usually, as anyone who has read me knows, I don't write a lot. I don't get a lot of ideas for stories, because most of the time, the ideas I get, they they come and they go pretty quickly. But once in a while, an idea, just keeps coming back to me. It sticks in my head. And when an idea keeps coming back and rattling around in my head for a period of months or years, then to me that's my my indication that this is something that I'm really interested in, and I should pay more attention to it. And so then I try and think about that idea in a more deliberate and intentional fashion. And so then I try and spin out different scenarios, different ways that this idea could turn into a story, could result in a dramatic situation. And so I'm thinking in a sort of a bunch of different directions, and those some of them wind up to be sort of dead ends. But eventually, I figure out what I think a story based on that idea would look like, and then I think about what kind of ending that story should have, what kind of ending I would like that story to have. And so then I can actually start writing the story itself. And for me, usually the first thing that I write for any given story is the ending. It's a paragraph that might be the final paragraph of the story, but it might not. It might be a paragraph somewhere near the end of the story, which to me represents the destination of the story. And once I have that, then I can start working on the rest of the story. And I usually don't work in any strict order. I'm sort of jumping around from one scene to another, back and forth. But I'm always writing these other scenes sort of with that destination in mind. And then eventually these various pieces and scenes, they all hook up into into something like a continuous story. And so in general, that has been, sort of my process for writing. And yeah, and I think that will probably remain, my overall process going forward.
Dan.
Yeah. So I'm kind of interested in the way in which you both use time a lot in your books. Ted, I almost feel like many of these stories in this collection have almost for me a sense of nostalgia somehow. People either explicitly trying to revisit their past, or paths not taken, or just whatever, the influence of some event, and as you move forward, and whether or not you're going to repeat it, or what it would mean to repeat it or revisit it. And Cadwell, there's a very explicit calling out of moments in time at different points in your work. And so I don't know that this kind of work must mean that you're attentive to time explicitly in the structure, but I was quite taken with that in both of your books. I mean, sort of patterns of history, if you like, or the notion that to not know history means you're doomed to repeat it, but even if you know it, you might repeat it anyway. So it's a reflection. I mean, I'd be curious to your response, to your responses to it.
Okay, I'll jump in. I was really struck by Ted Chiang's process in terms of like jumping around when he's writing. I thought that was really interesting, and it spoke to me because that is a similar approach. I don't think I ever know the ending to start. I do know the ending. I'm working on a trilogy right now, and I know the ending to the trilogy, which is a gift. I can work towards that, but I tend to jump around in time, in the timeline of the story, quite a lot, and I think that lends to what you're talking about, Dan. Like the way that I think about theme or connection is across different time periods because I'm writing them next to each other. So I'll write someone's perspective, and that perspective will be late in the book, and then I'll write another perspective early on. I'll use flashbacks in that way too. I'll have flashback connect back to other characters, or if I'm thinking about the history of the Virgin Islands, there's all kinds of ways that I'm already thinking about it in places that don't really line up to where they show up in the narrative. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but because I'm thinking about all of these things in kind of like a soup-like fashion, they kind of gel together in interesting ways, and the work of revision is just trying to make that coherent. There's a few times in the book where I just like note to the reader that time is passing, just because I feel like that it's helpful to a reader to do that. And I plan having to do the same thing with this book that I just finished doing editorial on. Because I'm not thinking about time as in this linear way, I think I do need to like set up some breadcrumbs to get people where I want to, and I need to think about structure. And usually the structure of it comes very late in the process because I've been jumping around so much. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but yeah, I'm interested in what Ted has to say about this.
So I guess to jump off of what Cadwell was saying, so I think that I guess, or to my mind, one of the things that fiction can do, one of the things that I think is maybe like a very an important sort of move in fiction is recontextualization. So like that's, you have some event which at one point is interpreted one way, and then later on with the, when you have new information, greater context, that event, is interpreted in a different way. And I think this is a sort of this can be a pretty powerful move. But I think in different forms it's I think maybe the backbone of a lot of fiction. And so that this can take a lot of different forms. A lot of the use of flashback serves as recontextualization, because when you learn more about a character's past, then you understand their actions now in a different light. And jumping back and forth between historical periods, again, when you learn more about a nation's past or a community's past, that will cast the current events in a different light. And even in a lot of ways, even what even surprise endings are a kind of recontextualization, because they surprise endings usually are the result of having the viewer understand events in one fashion, because certain information was withheld, and then when that information is revealed, the viewer or reader, they understand those events in a different light, and then their understanding of everything shifts radically. I mean, maybe radically. So I guess I guess I'm often thinking about storytelling moves in terms of recontextualization, and that is I guess that's sort of a question of both information management and time management. I don't mean those in the sort of pedestrian office productivity sense, but from a narrative standpoint, what information do you want your reader or viewer to have at any given point, and how that progress as the reader goes through the work, and I think that will almost inevitably involve moving back and forward in sort of the story time in within either the character's life or within the narrative, the events being recounted. So I guess I in some ways it seems to me maybe such a fundamental part of story that I'm not sure how to think about story without thinking about these issues, these questions of sort of moving back and forward in time.
I mean, but that, so for recontextualizing, I mean, that certainly puts the last story in your collection in a very new light. For me, it almost feels like a meta story about your process. I mean, people are trying to look into the, possible futures in order to revisit their present and to continually recontextualize their current decision making. I mean, many of them. Spoiler alert. Sorry, everyone. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom is a really. It gave me a lot to think about. But what you're saying here feels almost like at least one of the themes in that story somehow.
I mean, I suppose it is. I mean, I did not. I was not thinking about that story as any sort of metaphor for the act of writing, fiction, but
it need not be. But like I said, I mean, that was the first thing that came to mind as you were talking about that. So it's interesting to me. And if you don't mind me taking one extra step off the recontextualization kind of whatever cliff, we had talked about this before. I mean, I guess at least in criticism, in literary criticism, the question of the time in which something is written, are you supposed to take into account the overarching social context in which a book comes out? But I kind of feel like you can't help but do that. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm kind of curious if you wrote your book in one world, so to speak, and then your books came out into at least publicly, what's a very different world for many of your readers from the time in which you conceived it. Have you, I mean, do you write something and then you're done with it? Or does it still kind of swim around in your head and you see it in a different way now that the world is spinning around so violently? I don't know, Cadwell, any thoughts about that? I could have, anyway, yeah.
I could talk about that with heavy spoilers. There's a decision that I make near the end of the book that at the time, even when I was working on it, I was like, is this too much? Should I walk this back? And definitely after I had finished, with all the edits and, it was on its way. Like I would have to stop the presses. I, would sometimes like wake up like, man, that's a lot, There's just the climax involves, significant loss. And, even now I wonder about it, but it definitely seems more important now considering all the loss, due to COVID, and I think about it a lot in context of like, loss within, the communities of color in particular. There was a, I haven't said this out loud, but there's a namesake in the book that was a really good friend of mine growing up, and he recently passed due to COVID, same age. And so I've been thinking about the decision, like what you decide to do with fictional characters and what that is saying, and the kind of burden of like, dealing with really heavy traumatic events, and whether or not you're dealing with that stuff, even if it's just, fictional character, their words on the page, is it a disservice to the real thing? Does it help illuminate some of the real thing? And then also this question of being recontextualized, like the world in which when I wrote the story, I had no idea what would happen. But now knowing what happened, what happened with this world, it makes me look at that ending in a lot of different ways. I have different feelings about that ending now, in the same way that, recently readers have expressed to me that they've felt different things now reading it during the pandemic. And so, yeah, it's something I think about all the time. It's a question that like definitely haunts me, how, when you make these kind of decisions, how to do justice to them and how to, be responsible in the kinds of decisions, even when it's just fiction.
Yeah, no, I mean, I could definitely give, we could have an interesting discussion about what I would consider almost a straight up political reading of your book, as well as some of Ted's stories that, would be put in a context which wasn't exposed when they were written. So it's, I mean, great writing, I think, is like that. It whatever reveals different things when it's read at different times. I believe it has that kind of shape-shifting sort of ability. I don't know, Ted, any thoughts about now versus what was?
I don't think I have anything particularly useful to say on this. So I'm gonna pass on this one.
Sure.
So since this award is being given out under the auspices of a computational science institute, one of the, I think, fascinations of science fiction throughout its history has been thinking through the impact of machines on our lives, and nowadays what that looks like is AI, is computers, is cell phones, is apps. So I'm curious. A lot of science fiction writers imagined dystopias where robots or AIs or other forms of machines took over the world and our lives. I don't think any of them got this particular dystopia where machines and AIs took over our lives. But I'm curious about, what are y'all thinking about the ways that AI is used in the real world and how it's being used against us and how it could be used for our benefit? In the real world or in science fiction?
Okay, I'll go first on this one. So first, I guess, like in general, I think that our fear of technology, our fear of AI in particular, and our fear of technology in general, I think those are better understood as not so much fears of technology per itself, but as fears of how capitalism uses technology against us. Because technology has the potential for sort of in a lot of ways it has potential for individual liberation. One of the things, like, not a few years ago, I read this article that talked about the Luddites, and we associate the word Luddite with a sort of unthinking fear and rejection of technology, but the actual Luddites, that was not what motivated them at all. It wasn't that they hated machines. What they were opposed to was the fact that the additional profits from these machines, the additional profits went only to the factory owners and not to the people working the machines. So they were not anti-technology. They were basically in favor of profit sharing, and they actually specifically did not destroy machines whose factory owners were paying their workers more as a result of the increased profits. So they have gotten now their name is synonymous with a sort of knee-jerk rejection of technology. But what they were actually wanting was that for the benefits of technology to be distributed more fairly, because if people because technology it increases our productivity, and who benefits from that? In theory, it could benefit individuals. But in practice, it generally has not. And so like there was time, like sort of I think in the early days of the computer revolution, when personal computers, we all saw that they had enormous potential to give individuals a lot more options, a lot more freedoms, because you could publish anything, you could read, learn things online, in outside of sort of traditional institutional structures. But and I think that was certainly a path that things could have gone down, but instead what we've seen is that corporate power has taken over the computer revolution the way it has taken over many other technological revolutions. And so computers are now a lot of the benefits of computers, of digital technology, sort of the increased productivity, all of the the profits of that accrue to giant corporations rather than to individuals now. But I but yeah, I think, that is, yeah, it is not intrinsic to technology. It is not inevitable. It is something that I think, yeah, could go a different way. And I think, I think it's important for us to sort of remember that and try and I guess to fight the real enemy, as to quote Sinead O'Connor.
God bless her. Cadwell, before you answer, I just have to share that while I was formulating that question about machines being used against us, my Roomba came to life and started cleaning the house very noisily. And so hopefully you didn't hear it. I was able to mute it in time and stop it. But just, yeah, they don't like being talked about, apparently.
They hear us, yeah. For sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so, kind of responding to what Ted was talking about, and, just zooming out a little bit, like if we were to reduce it to a binary, there's two political objectives for science fiction. One is to warn, you imagine a future where the worst has happened or something is pretty bad. And that's to warn against us going down that route. But it is also, inspiration, to try to inspire. And thinking about like artificial intelligence in particular and ownership, I find it really interesting, and I've tried to write I've written a couple stories about this where the artificial intelligence is collectively owned and collectively governed. And I feel like in a lot of ways, that is an answer to the particularly dystopian version of artificial intelligence ownership we have now, where there's a few hands that own it, and it's very extractive. It extracts data, it extracts resources, and we might get some convenience out of it, but definitely none of the profit. And so thinking about artificial intelligence, especially in communities that could benefit from the use of it, like in terms of thinking about those communities being able to own their own AIs and being able to use it to help them deal with community problems. So, one of the stories I wrote, Monsters Come Howling at Their Season, in The Verge, was about an artificial intelligence used to respond to climate change, specifically hurricanes. And the artificial intelligence was used by the community for disaster preparedness, kind of keeping stock of resources and where they are and helping distribute them. But also as a way of, as like an early reporter of places that were, significantly damaged. You could talk to the artificial intelligence. The way that I imagined it, it was like a kind of Alexa-like device, a black box, and you could talk to it or communicate with it about things that were happening in your community, in your neighborhood, right outside, and also things that were happening in your home. And that information would be communicated to other people across the community, and they could respond really quickly to it. And so thinking about AI in that way, like actually, solving human problems, because the main objective isn't profit. The main objective is, a resource that can help communities, I think is a really interesting way of looking at this particular problem.
Yeah, I want to see more collective ownership in science fiction and in the real world. Ted,
Dan, do you have any thoughts on this as a computer science professor?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. They're kind of all over the map. I mean, the collective ownership idea, I think, is really, it's really interesting. And the truth is, like, I mean, this is so naive, but I didn't understand why, as soon as everybody understood that basically all of your movements, either on the keyboard or wherever, were monetized, that there wasn't some way of creating a sort of nano or microfinancing. Like, we're all connected, right? So, okay, every time one of my data widgets gets sent from A to B, that's, some fraction of something. And I bet it's kind of like, those stories of exponential growth. It's like, well, my one widget went here and then it went to 2 other places, and all of a sudden my one billionth of a penny, you know, turned into $100 in my bank account at the end of a month. You know, just from all the passing of my information, you know, which I had to happily click through because I wanted to buy a book or a pair of shoes. You know, I did that. Like that strikes me as low-hanging fruit as a way of collective ownership and collective benefit. You know, around that aspect of computing and artificial intelligence, in the sense of whatever, redirecting marketing, all those kinds of things. So I mean, look, it's clear that it's not all bad. Here we are, like the world is falling apart for a biological reason, and here we are connected because of some extraordinary technological advance. And otherwise, you know, it would be like in the times of Henry VIII. We'd all be in our tiny towns and nobody would be visiting us because the pandemic was here or there or anywhere, and we wouldn't be able to talk to each other. So there, you know, it's not all bad. It's always a kind of Janus sort of, you know, thing. There's good and there's bad for, you know, but I mean, whether or not the bad generally, I mean, it's, you know, some connected to capitalism, some connected to power, but what one would hope is that with different people in charge, that there could be a little bit more of a jujitsu going on, you know, whereby the bad was also exploited for the good in some way. I do think a lot about, you know, how when it's realized generally in literature or in movies, it's funny. It's almost like that Tolstoy kind of quote. It's like any happy version of all happy versions of AI are the same, but all the unhappy ones are different, and in those differences are the interesting stories. So we see all the unhappy ones. I don't know that it's a responsibility, so to speak, of artists to try to. I mean, so that feels like an interesting artistic problem. How do you make a good version of an AI future that doesn't seem anodyne? You know, that's just like, oh, we're all happy, or, you know, all our stuff is being delivered to us all the time, and we know everything, and life is good. Like making that an integral part of a story to give readers, viewers, participants something to aspire to, you know, instead of something to fear. It feels tough to do, actually. You know, everything comes out like Shangri-La in this other version. So how do you make that a more, because, you know, at the end of the day, you also want to do something interesting artistically. So how do you square that circle? I'm not quite sure.
I take comfort in the fact that humans will always be garbage no matter what technology we have. So even if we use technology to solve many of our problems, we'll still manage to create new ones or otherwise mess it all up. And therein lies many a good story, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my answer was, with the stories that I worked on, was to put the bad stuff other places. So having a character deal with loss, like a loss in a family. In the story that I was talking about with the hurricanes, you know, that is drama right there. Hurricanes are destructive, and so, you know, there's a lot of trauma that's coming from environmental disaster, and so the AIs are fine, but everything else is kind of messed up.
Right.
So Ted, The Great Silence is one of my favorites of your stories, and it's in Exhalation. And among other things, it's about how humans are obsessed with looking for intelligent life on other planets, but like really aggressively uninterested in intelligent life that's not human, that's already here. And the parrot who is telling this story doesn't speculate about why that is, but I wonder what you think about why humans can't or won't connect with the non-human intelligences that surround us.
Well, so, you know, I think for a long time, people probably were not paying, super close attention to animals and the subtleties of their behavior. It was very easy to dismiss them. And I guess once you have people, like primatologists or marine biologists, who are studying animal behavior, more attentively, they they have tried to tell other people about just how smart other animals are. But I guess I suppose the general public probably maybe can't afford to acknowledge that, because it is because that would mean recognizing sort of how much animal cruelty is built into our world. If like, okay, so like Sam, I happen to know that you're a vegetarian, and most people are switching to vegetarianism is too difficult for most people. It is too difficult for me. Yeah, it is something that it's something that I struggle with. And yeah, I think, people don't, no one wants to hear about how, about the feelings of cows, because, once you start, really thinking seriously about the feelings of cows, then, you start to realize, like, oh man, maybe, maybe we shouldn't be eating so many cows. So I guess I think it's it's just easier for us to ignore these things, to overlook these things. And it is and of course, like, we are very easy. I mean, it is very easy for us. We're very good at sort of ignoring cruelty to humans as well. So it's not like recognizing them as as thinking beings would automatically mean that we'd stop treating them badly, because our system is also built on treating people badly, and we continue to do that. Most chocolate is the product of child slave labor. That's yeah, who wants to hear that? So yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
I have a question for Cadwell, but I want to also put a plug in for folks who are tuning in to send questions if they have any. I believe people can submit Q&A submissions. So do that as we start to move towards closing out. Cadwell, the lesson engages history and the legacy of colonialism to tell a fresh story of first contact, which is impressive because we've all read a million first contact stories. Are there any other speculative fiction tropes and storylines that you are excited to tackle through a similar lens?
So it's interesting you frame it that way, because what I'm working on right now is about werewolves and vampires. And so like things that we've seen a million iterations of, and I'm looking at it through like a sociological lens. So like I'm imagining, so like with the lesson, there's this how do you respond? How does it change human identity and culture if there's a threat from without? And in No Gods, No Monsters, this project that I'm working on now, it's how does a threat from within change the psyche? So like if there are monsters and we finally realize that they exist, what does that do psychologically to us? How does that affect our social systems? What do we do when monsters start advocating for themselves as members of humanity?
That feels very political, Cadwell. Can't
Right.
help but say that.
Right, yeah, definitely. And also like thinking about like how intersectionality plays with that too. Like what's the difference between a werewolf that's coming from like a marginalized community versus like a vampire that's from, that is coming from, a wealthy community, and how those dynamics play across different monsters as well. So thinking about applying the same kind of political, sociological approach to these kinds of tropes. And there's some stuff in there about like solidarity economics as well, like collective ownership, and how monsters would, quietly be able to gather resources for themselves, especially if they're, if they're being marginalized in some way, to help create stability for themselves. And of course, that is, in some ways metaphors for other things. Not definitely not a one-to-one thing, but I am talking about other things in the exploration of that.
Great. Yes, and so folks who haven't seen it already, Cadwell just released the cover of No Gods, No Monsters, which is a gorgeous cover. So folks should go check that out. Google it, pre-order it, all that stuff. We have a question coming in from Misha Stone. William Gibson's famous quotation, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed," comes to mind in conjunction with something Toyoshi Onibushi said recently along the lines that the future is felt first by the marginalized. How does or can science fiction explore those dynamics at play? Who wants to go first?
Okay. Do you want to start, Ted, or should I jump in?
You can go.
Okay. So the reason this question got me excited was because I was having a conversation with my wife last night, and we were talking about Flint, Michigan, and how for a very long time people there were telling people in power, there's something wrong with the water, and they were ignored. And she said something that was really striking, and it kind of blew my mind. And it basically boiled down to there's an alternative reading of environmental crisis where you can talk about it in terms of people with privilege finding places to throw their junk, and then realizing that the earth is not a bigot. Like the earth will redistribute all of the junk that you put in one place everywhere, and we'll all feel the effects of it. And so, looking back at climate catastrophe or what led to this current era, a lot of it was decisions to, we're going to do this thing and profit off of it and be comfortable, but we're going to put all of the trash basically in marginalized communities that can't stick up for themselves and resist that, devastation. And so I think that science fiction is always, or at least I enjoy reading science fiction that, plays or explores that idea that there are some people that benefit from, technological advancement, and then there's other people that, foot the bill, and that we could have had an alternative present or alternative future if we thought of everyone as, you know, beneficiaries of technology and not just like some people get the benefit and some people suffer.
Ted?
I don't know. I think Cadwell answered that pretty well. I don't know that I have anything useful to add to that.
We have a question from Ted. Hi, Ted. Thanks for tuning in. A different Ted, not you, Ted. Both of your writing seems driven by a deeply felt curiosity that takes you to some surprising, maybe even inconvenient places. Do you have some favorite examples of times when your stories surprised or unnerved you?
You go, Ted.
I don't think I have any examples like that. And I guess maybe that has to do with my process, as I was discussing earlier, because I start with the ending, because I sort of, I need to know where the story will wind up before I can write it. So in that sense, I'm not really in a position to be surprised or unnerved by my own work. At least, not on an individual story level where, the story went to a place that I wasn't expecting it to. Over sort of my body of work as a whole, I guess I was not always aware of sort of the commonalities between my stories, and so in some ways those are things which like someone had to point out to me, or else maybe I observed myself. But looking back, I see certain trends in my work, certain recurring themes, which I was not aware of, and so in that sense, those were sort of unexpected, but yeah, I don't know if it'd be accurate to call them surprising or unnerving. Those were just maybe kind of like interesting to see that my mind does sort of lean in specific directions, even without my consciously attempting to do that.
Cadwell, any times that stories have surprised or unnerved you?
My own stories. So I mean, this is kind of retreading old ground, but with the lesson, I imagine aliens that respond to threat with disproportionate violence, wrath, and so by nature, when they feel threatened by something, they respond, in a very drastic way. And because I set that up in the beginning of the novel, eventually it became clear that that would have a particular kind of ending. And when I wrote it initially, it just seemed logical. But then after some time and wrestling with it, it definitely unnerved me. So I would say that.
We have a question specifically for you, Ted, from Amanda Sun, who asks, as an aspiring novelist and an Asian American student, I'd love to hear about Ted Chiang's challenges of writing as Asian American, discrimination, lack of role models in traditional American literature, etc., and how he overcame them.
Let's see, what can I say about that? So, I mean, I certainly was conscious of the fact that there were pretty much no Asian Americans writing science fiction when I first started trying to write stories. I mean, or I guess I shouldn't say there was none at all, but there was a writer, William F. Wu, who published a bunch of stories in analog. But so I mean, I was definitely conscious of the fact that I did not see any any Asian seeming names in the magazines, and my name would reveal my my ethnicity, and I don't know that I'm not aware of like specific obstacles or like I was not the subject of I think the maybe the type of okay, so I think that I know that a lot of writers, Asian American writers who are trying to enter the field, they get comments, they get feedback in various forms, either at conventions or in email or comments on their story. I should say that when I was entering the field, none of those venues existed. So in a lot of ways, even though it was I think we were all working in isolation in a way that writers are not now. But but in a way that was maybe a blessing, because there wasn't really an avenue for for me to get pushback from readers or and I wasn't attending conventions, so so there wasn't the chance, the opportunity for people to come up to me and say condescending things. So I guess I think sort of by virtue of to some extent the era that I came up in, and the fact that yes, science fiction was it was all it was all submissions by mail. There was no face-to-face interaction. So I think in some ways I don't know if it was easier, but at least I was not was not as aware of the sort of well-intentioned condescension that that people today like are and I guess not only well-intentioned, but just whether they were whether they people, whatever people's intentions were, I was mostly I was spared those because of the specific route I took of just I didn't attend conventions, and I submitted manuscripts through the mail, and that was that. So that I think was an advantage of the sort of more remote and impersonal nature of the field back then. So all I can say is that hopefully now the greater level of interaction that is possible, hopefully people can find support mechanisms to counterbalance the racism that they are encountering as well. That people can find others who can I don't know, provide emotional support and answer their questions in a way that also was kind of, I think, unavailable to writers back when I started.
We have a viewer question from Wansi Rodriguez, who, full disclosure, is my husband, who asks, afternoon all, in between seeing patients, he's a nurse practitioner, but curious about if anyone is watching Lovecraft Country and cares to share their take or opinion regarding its use of the painful real history of racism in the US as woven with fictional horror. Anybody? Lovecraft Country?
I am on episode 4. You know, I think the last episode I saw was the haunted house episode. So I'm waiting for a good like afternoon to like binge the rest of it. I haven't found it yet. But
it may not be the best binging show. It's pretty heavy.
Right. No, it is pretty heavy, and it's probably one of the reasons why it's taking me so long to get through it. But the first 4 episodes are deeply engaged with that, you know, combining horror and, you know, the racial injustice, and some of it is, you know, just really amazingly done and striking. Like there's a scene in the first episode where they find themselves in a sundown town. I think that's what they call them, and they need to get out of the town by sunset, but they can't do it by like breaking the speed limit. And so then there's like the officers behind them following them out of town, and they're trying to like keep their speed below, I guess 25 miles or something. And that is just like some of the most tense television I've seen. And then right after that, there's like, I think they're vampires. They're like giant monsters come out of the ground and start eating people. And so like, just that like really interesting, the fact that they chose to have those things sit right next to each other was really interesting and cool. And then the haunted house episode with experimentations on people, and then those people are then haunting the house. There's this really gruesome image of like a basketball player's body with a baby's head, and it's deeply disturbing. So yeah, I'm a fan of the show. I'm way behind.
Well, you know, if and when you finish it, call me if you need to process.
Okay.
My husband and I have thoughts and feelings.
Oh, I'm just going to say real quick, Sam, if you may have missed, there's a question that is classified under the answers tab, but it is not actually answered. So you might want to just look at that.
I did not look there.
Okay, so I'll just say, I mean, I've not watched Lovecraft Country, the TV series, but I have read the novel, and I recommend the novel. And I'll just add that, you know, it is it's kind of funny because like the author of the novel, Matt Ruff, he is local here in Seattle, and he actually pitched this idea to HBO as a series, and they were not interested, and so he wrote it as a novel, and you know. Then I guess, you know, yeah, years later, you know, they're like, oh, maybe it actually could be a TV series. So yeah, it had a sort of an unusual, I guess, development process of you know, coming full circle as an idea for a TV series, which, you know, rejected, written as a novel, and then finally adapted into a TV series.
Amazing. Well, thank you. And thank you for the heads up about the question falsely categorized as answered. I'm going to ask it, and then I think I have like one more, and then we're coming up on 90 amazing minutes. So we should probably start to close out, even though Lord knows I could do this all day. I want to respect everyone's time. So Samuel Montgomery Blinn asks, Mr. Chiang has previously presented a fascinating thesis on the difference between fantasy and science fiction, that fantasy assumes a personal universe, whereas science fiction assumes an impersonal one. Mr. Turnbull, do you see that kind of distinction in your approach to the two genres?
I mean, that's a brilliant analysis. I must admit that I have not thought about that, but it feels correct. I will say though, you know, as a nerd, I grew up watching. So I grew up watching Stargate, SG-1 and Stargate Atlantis, and what I really love about those shows is that there is a lot of, you know, science fiction elements, but there's this interesting question at the heart of both of those shows about like the divine, or what constitutes the divine, or where do people go beyond, you know, just this plane of existence. And that is fantastical, yes, but it is within a sci-fi context. And I find it, even when it's subtle, when you're asking that kind of question about, you are faced with a universe that seems uncaring, and the question is it really uncaring, or is there something more? And then the other part of that question is like, if there's something more, is that thing uncaring? I find that exploration, you know, exciting even in science fiction. I think that they can live in both genres.
Plus, you could argue that Stargate Atlantis has vampires in it. So
Right,
outer space vampires.
Yeah, space vampires, the wraith.
So we have one question from Ralph Mamo, which I'll ask, and then I have a short one to close out. Has anyone experienced the need or impulse to increase the severity or extremity of imagined future crises due to what's going on in the present? I.e., do you find that imagined future crises keep seeming tamer and tamer because of growing crises in the present? I call this plausibility creep.
Well, I mean, I guess, you know, my work is not, you know, so much about, you know, sort of near future crises. So this isn't directly applicable to me, but I mean, I guess, you know, I think, you know, we are all sort of conscious of the fact that, you know, the world is, you know, and you know, even if we set aside 2020, I think we're all aware that, you know, over the last few years, you know, the world has gotten much, much weirder than, you know, we previously were sort of, you know, expecting. And so things have, yeah, so I guess in the same way that, you know, writers might have been worried about, you know, like, are there technological predictions, you know, going to become out of date? You know, yeah, I think, you know, I think writers, you know, of recent years are sort of wondering, like, yeah, when we imagine, you know, just how weird the future is, you know, do we need to, you know, are we being, are our predictions about weirdness seeming dated? So, yeah, I think, you know, that is a general concern. There's definitely a sort of a general concern among science fiction writers.
Cadwell, plausibility creep, imagine futures seeming tamer.
I don't know if this exactly answers the question, but I was thinking about Blade Runner and then its sequel, Blade Runner 2049, and how that imagined future didn't quite match up to our future, the future in the original Blade Runner. And what they did was they just imagined that as an alternate timeline, and I found that really interesting. And so thinking about, even if you imagine a future that seemed tamer than our future, thinking about that as that, even like if you're writing a dystopia, or you're writing something that's kind of like apocalyptic, and it turns out to be not as bad as our apocalypse, thinking of that as like the better timeline is just really interesting to me. That science fiction writers are reaching for something drastic, and then it turns out to be tame. But, you know, responding to it more directly, I think that looking at 2020 as a novel would just be insane. You know, there's just too much has happened. We were talking about this in the MFA workshop last week, I think, about just like, if someone turned 2020 in as a story, everyone in the workshop would be like, this is unrealistic. Please go back to the drawing board, that kind of thing. And so it's just, I don't know. I think it's a weird time where science fiction and fantasy writers or speculative fiction writers have to be a little bit more sober than actual reality in order to be believable. It's strange.
Dan.
Just a couple of thoughts. One is that I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Charlie Whelan, who wrote a novel, The Rationing, which was about a pandemic and an unprepared United States that required some assistance from China to treat it. And I wouldn't quite call it a romp, but anyway, it just speaks to the fact that, and it just came out, I don't know, maybe 18 months ago. So it was written before any of this, and it's just an interesting that it's interesting to me that in the spectrum of stuff that gets written, you know, I mean, we're sort of suffering from a sampling error, right? So we know the ones that happened, and then we look back to when things were written that presaged stuff that happened, and we forget about all the things that didn't happen, you know, which still, you know, are other things that could happen. You know, I mean, you know, will things get, I mean, are there so many terrible things that nothing newly terrible could happen? That seems unlikely as a pessimist. You know, it does come back to this other comment that, you know, there are good things that might happen, which coming from me doesn't even sound like me, but I want to believe that that's possible. And that question also, I mean, not purposely, but you know, there's all kinds of amazing, whatever, scientific developments that nobody foresaw, writers or scientists. You know, it's that, again, it's that Arthur C. Clarke thing, you know, that the science of the future, I don't know, would seem like the magic to the people in the past, something like that. I'm screwing it up, but that, you know, that magic is happening now for people who were behind us. So, you know, I do like to believe that there's an infinite and ongoing amount of material, some of it, you know, some of it, whatever, pushing out bad scenarios, some of it possibly inspiring, interesting and hopeful stories. And just thinking about that is interesting to me. Cadwell, if I think I'm right that Jackson ends up being a professor of speculative fiction, or am I? Isn't that true? So that there's kind of a future, a proposed future for the genre, you know, embedded in your novel, which I kind of enjoyed seeing. So,
right. Yeah, it's post-invasion lit.
Yes. Yeah.
So
yeah.
And in that future, it would be harder to you know, differentiate whether or not that was literary or speculative. Was the conversation in the class?
Yes. Yes. Precisely that. You know, so the fact that aliens actually came. So what would that do to writing?
Yeah, one of the things that make this such a fresh take on First Contact is I've never seen First Contact grapple with the impact of First Contact on literary criticism and the Academy. So,
right.
Good show. So I want to close this out with hopefully a cheerful question, or at least a positive one. What books, short stories, writers, things are giving you hope or excitement or impressing you lately? You know, I got to read a whole bunch of really great books written last year and picked two really amazing ones. So I'm feeling really good about the genre. What's making you feel good about the genre or writing in general?
I guess I'm not sure because I guess I think the best novels that I've read recently were not what we would call genre novels. They were not science fiction or fantasy novels, but I very much liked Normal People by Sally Rooney. That was a super bestseller. And yeah, I guess now it's a Hulu TV series. But yeah, I liked that a lot. Also, I also liked Fleischman is in Trouble. That's by Taffy Brodesser Akner. That's the sort of a kind of a comic novel about divorce that I thought was really really well observed and yeah, and I think it goes in a different direction than you expect.
Cadwell?
So yeah, I have a similar answer to Ted in the sense that I've been reading some things outside of the genre. Just finished reading the Nickel Boys, and it's really powerful, really well done. I'm just learning a ton from reading it, and I want to reread it, as an education, and how to write these kinds of stories. I've been rereading again The Found and the Lost. This is the anthology collection of Le Guin novellas and novelettes, and that has just been really. I really enjoy her work, so just rereading those again. I just had the privilege of reading for a blurb The Conductors by Nicole Glover, and that was a really fantastic book. It's not out yet; it's coming out. Been reading a lot of short story collections. I've been reading. It's not so recent now, but I recently, within the last year, finished Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. Just really great work. I will also, and I'm not doing this because you're here, Ted, but I recently read Exhalation and just loved it very much. And I consider it an education every time I'm reading your work. So just saying that. Don't want to make you uncomfortable, but it's the truth. And yeah, I've been a short story collection by Alice Munro, and I've been reading a lot of nonfiction. So I've been reading The Burning, which is the history of the Tulsa massacre, talking about that. And that has just been illuminating. But I guess in one way it makes me hopeful is that this is a subject that is being talked about. Like, it's in Lovecraft Country, it's in Watchmen. And so when I reference that, it's not something that people are like, oh, what is that? It's something that people know a lot about. And that's comforting, that we're telling difficult stories, whether or not through speculative fiction or just telling them.
Yeah. Dan, what about you? What are you reading that's giving you hope or excitement?
It's a little bit of a busman's holiday, but I kind of like I feel like there's been a real rebirth of the scientist memoir genre. Lab Girl by Hope Yaren I thought was really interesting. The Vague Conjectures by Karen Olson. She was going to be a mathematician, then wasn't a mathematician, and they're kind of interesting meditations on the way individuals come to a scientific discipline and then either choose it or move sideways. I just started the Book of Unconformities, which is sort of a memoir, geology, loss, or even a book like H is for Hawk. Again, I'm interested in how different people see the world, and as a scientist, I'm always interested in the scientist's lens on his or her own life. But it also becomes a very engaging way of learning science. So I really love it as a sort of exposition of science as well as something personal. So those are the kind of books I'm reading now. At the beginning of the pandemic, besides the reading for our award, I had decided I was going to immerse myself in all the histories of people who went through shitty times, and so that I wouldn't feel so bad about what I and my family were experiencing. And so, like, you know, reading about life in the during the Blitz, for example, you know, read a couple of those, or finally read Mandela's memoir. You know, how does one live through so much restriction and still be hopeful? And then for totally, I read the last, I read the Mantell trilogy, and and it's interesting to me, as I referenced before, like, we've been living with plagues forever. You know, I mean, Henry wakes up and his people tell him, you can't go south because the plague is in the south. So he goes north or he stays home, you know, and people have been wearing masks and staying away from each other forever to stay away from viruses. It's just going to keep happening. So whether or not science catches up with it. So anyway, I read around. Those are the kinds of things. But I do enjoy the scientist memoir. Well written. So yeah. Thanks for asking, Sam.
Yeah.
How about you? What are you reading?
A lot of horror. It's been horror. It's been horror for several months now. I do have a horror novel coming out in December called The Blade Between. So part of it is just immersion in the genre, but also I've been feeling like it's a horror movie. But I just read a book also following the trend, not within the genre. But I read a really brilliant book that came out last month called These Violent Delights, about a really unhealthy relationship between two teenage boys in the 70s. Sort of like a Leopold Loeb, but super gay, which I guess Leopold and Loeb were anyway. But anyway, it's really messed up and violent and twisted and disturbing and amazing. So These Violent Delights is my recommendation for everyone who's looking to be deeply, deeply unsettled. And I feel like this is a good place to close out. Ted, Cadwell, any closing thoughts as award laureates that you are?
No, just thanks for reading all those books, Sam. You know, because I know that couldn't have been easy.
It was a delightful chore.
Yeah, you know, pretty similar. I'm just grateful to be here, and I'm honored to be a part of this. So, you know, thank you. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Dan. Thank the Neukom Institute for just this tremendous honor.
Dan, you want to close us out?
Sure. Well, again, thanks for writing great stuff. It's a pleasure. Anyway, enjoyable, interesting, disturbing at times, but great to read. So thank you for that. As somebody who tries to write a little bit, it always feels so complicated to me. And so when somebody gets it out right, I'm generally in awe. So thank you. And for everybody who listened, I hope it was interesting. And one last shout out to Christine, who makes it all happen. And everyone stay safe and vote. All right. Okay.
Perfect.
Be well.
See ya.
See ya.